Okay, I think we'll start, everybody. My name's Chris Mahony. I'm co-founder and CEO of Peloria. We're really excited to be here today to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities of early warning approaches, particularly AI-driven and social science-informed AI-driven early warning systems. Some of those risks, some of those significant opportunities, how both risks and opportunities are manifesting very quickly as this rapidly evolving space enables so much. We're really pleased to be joined today, firstly, by Demetriou. Spyros is Senior Operations Officer in the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group within the World Bank. He's had a distinguished career across both the bank and the United Nations. He leads presently the FCB Group's approach on conflict risk monitoring and has a depth of experience across both institutions in both the Middle East and Africa. We're also joined by Eduardo Albrecht, Professor Eduardo Albrecht, who is Peloria's chief ethnographer. He has been examining methods from an anthropological point of view for a decade now to leverage particularly big language data sets to inform approaches that optimize predictive accuracy, particularly around social movements across Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia. We're also joined by the next generation of leadership in early warning, Ayaka Oishi. Ayaka has been working in Peloria now for almost 2 years. She is a program manager and a research associate and leads on much of the operations at Peloria, bringing together the data scientists with the social scientists on the operational side. And she already has experience both back in Japan, her home country, and here at USIP in the United States. We're also being joined by Daanish Masood. Daanish is co-lead of the United Nations Innovation Cell, where they look at how they can leverage emergent methods to optimize their understanding of fragility and risk across the plethora of situations, of course, before them in the UN. He also has a deep background in as a political affairs officer in the UN system, both at headquarters and in the Middle East. So in terms of the agenda, that's the introduction. What we'll do is I'll now hand over to each of our colleagues to introduce what they do, speak to some of the examples of what they've done, what they're trying to do, perhaps some of the achievements, but also some of the risks and opportunities that they're seeing accompany those methods that perhaps have the greatest utility. So with that, maybe I'll hand over to Eduardo first, and of course here you can see on the invitation on the conference workshop website the biographies of our colleagues in greater depth. But with that, I'll hand over to Eduardo perhaps first to share your experience developing these capacities with Peloria.
Sure.
Eduardo?
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Chris. The experience that I'd like to briefly share with you, just for 5 minutes, so I'll give a kind of overview of the highlights, is a project that we worked on in Kenya over the past 2 years almost. This project was very interesting because it was the first of its kind to utilize a very large data set of online language in combination with economic and political indicators to be able to forecast violence in a number of different regions and geographies in Kenya. Now, as many of you know, Kenya is a very large country with very different types of climate, population, ethnic groups, economic systems, conflict dynamics. So this wasn't an easy challenge. So I'll speak a little bit first about where some successes were achieved and where we believe there's still some room for further discovery. First, we were able to achieve what is significant predictive accuracy for these different geographies across different types of violence. So by leveraging this large corpus of online language data, and we monitored more than 500 influential actors and all of their language on social media. So you can imagine these are millions of tweets and other types of social media posts. We were able to forecast with around 85–90% accuracy whether there would be an increase in terrorist attacks, armed conflict, political violence, violence against civilians. So the predictive capacity is there. In fact, we're very enthusiastic about what this means for development and other types of programmatic and policy interventions. The challenges, I believe, lie around the frameworks that we use to understand thematic categories, both online and offline. So, for example, what constitutes a riot or a protest or a terrorist attack, or what constitutes violence against civilians? I believe there's still a lot of exciting discoveries to be made there, because we're in an interesting historical moment in which we're getting our feet wet with this just massive amount of data sets that are out there. And there seems to be a kind of one-to-one translation in terms of, okay, this means armed attack, we're just going to interpret it as an armed attack. Or this means violence against civilians, we're going to interpret it as violence against civilians. And this goes for violence data, but also for a lot of the economic indicators, political indicators, a lot of the social perceptions indicators, like the online language and the sentiment around online language. But the reality is that it's not so simple. We're not always, the data we get doesn't always represent exactly the phenomenon on the ground. There's a process of translation. And I think this issue of what gets lost in translation, or sometimes what gets mistranslated, requires some additional attention from the early warning community. And I know that, in fact, a lot of academics and policymakers and scholars are looking into this. But I believe that there is still a lot that can be sort of untied from this Gordian knot of data and what that data represents. In particular, and this is the biggest challenge I think that we're going to face, is when it comes to social perceptions data. So we know that there's some very advanced techniques, for example, natural language processing, that can change unstructured data, like language in a variety of different languages, into structured data. So sentiment scores and a variety of different types of sentiment scores. This is not just positive, negative. You can look at violence-oriented language, and there's a lot of work that's being done there. Now that translation, that process of translation from unstructured data to structured data, is non-trivial. There is the potential for, say, analysts from outside to look at it from a kind of a cultural framework that we're used to working with. So maybe words that seem extremist to us are not as extremist in that local context. For example, in the US, we often use a lot of hyperbole, but in other countries, language is a lot more neutral. And I'll wrap up by saying that, and I might be over my time limit here, that the way that we found at Peloria is possible to, in part, overcome this issue of being lost in translation is by incorporating the lived experiences of people that are involved in those cultural dynamics. And this means not just listening, it means including those individuals in the process of programming. But I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions on this issue afterwards.
Thanks, Daanish. And for those that have questions, please put them in the chat. Over to you, Daanish, to follow on what you're doing, the opportunities, and perhaps one or two of your examples.
First of all, thank you so much, Chris and others, for convening this. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to see all of you. Many friends in the audience that I'm seeing right now. So what I'll do in my remarks quickly is give you 3 examples of some of the work we're doing. So as Chris said, we're a special unit inside the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and our job is to basically pilot and scale cutting-edge methods. In modeling, so the 3 examples I'll give will be a geospatial model, automated speech recognition, and the third example will be basically a combination of georeferential conflict event data and actor-centric models, and how we might use it. Starting with the geospatial model, I want to begin by, and I thought it'd be easier, since I'm speaking just for 5 minutes, to not distract you with visuals, but to just focus on my remarks. On the geospatial model, here we were trying to look at water diminishment and how it correlates to upticks in social unrest and violence, particularly in the Tigris-Euphrates basin, which is the second most water-stressed region in the world. And so in that regard, we decided to take data from hard sensors on 25 Earth-orbiting satellites with a focus initially on Iraq. So our goal here was to, at a sub-district level in Iraq, measure levels of rates of water diminishment as measured by indicators such as land subsidence. For instance, the sinking of the soil. When water aquifers get depleted under the land, the soil actually, the surface of the soil actually changes, or the surface level of the soil changes. Soil moisture, vegetation, surface water extent, which you can think of as how high is the water in lakes and rivers, etc. And then to combine all those things over a 30 to 40 year period using data from the Sentinel satellites, the NASA GRACE mission, etc., and then correlating it with georeferential conflict event data such as UCDP or ACLED, right? And here it bears mentioning, of course, that establishing some kind of causation would be too high a threshold. We're only interested in correlation. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because we're interested in seeing how water diminishment changes levels of social unrest. And as many of you know, the UN system's second largest special political mission is actually in Iraq. And so we want to assist the mission, and we want to help the mission help the government. So ultimately, we ended up with a 500,000 data point database that we hope one day to make available to the Iraqi government. And this, I'm using that maybe as a segue to talk about one of the pain points, which is how do some of these models actually support decision making? And it's unclear. And how do we ensure some kind of uptake by the relevant actors? Let's move on to the second example. And of course, I'm giving you guys, these basically 3 appetizers in the hope that we can have a more robust discussion around some of the issues. Second example is automated speech recognition. Now, so as you can imagine, in conflict context, similar to some of this, links a little bit to what Eduardo was saying before me. In conflict contexts, such as Libya and Yemen, internet penetration is limited, right? It's sometimes in the low 30s, sometimes actually less than 30%. And radio and television still matter tremendously. So we need a system that allows us to potentially understand systematically what's being said on radio and television. And in that regard, we're working with some cutting-edge ASR, automated speech recognition technology, in order to understand what's being said in Libyan and Yemeni radio and TV in Arabic dialect, which is Libyan Arabic and Yemeni Arabic are low resource languages. So there aren't existing resources off the shelf that we can deploy here. We actually, in the case of Yemeni, had to build a 120,000 word corpus. In the case of Libyan, we went with a 50,000 word corpus in order to do that. And that content is automatically transcribed, and then it is translated using some cutting-edge machine translation methods that are, let's say if Google Translate achieves 65% accuracy, and I say that as an Arabic speaker, this platform maybe achieves an 80% level of accuracy, right? And then the idea there is to then subject that to different types of natural language processing and also tone and emotion detection. For instance, we can listen to the tone in which someone is making a statement, right? And recognize what emotions do we accord to that. And there are a number of models that are available for that. I think there's somehow, now again, this is a level of, if you push me on details, I'll be in trouble because this is not my area of expertise. But my sense for those of us that are coming from psychology or neuroscience backgrounds is that it's based on the Ekman model of 7 core emotions. Now here again, this is cutting edge work, right? And there's some stuff around sentiment analysis. There's the possibility of using GPT-3. There's the possibility of using PyTorch libraries for those of you who are more technically oriented, such as transformers or Hugging Face, in order to analyze the large corpora of text that are going to be collected from the automated transcription of radio and TV. But more importantly, alongside this, we're also doing some ethnographic work with our missions in Yemen and Libya to understand how they might use this kind of information and how they what existing methods they use in order to make decisions around this and in order to anticipate upticks in violence. Third and final example is some recent work that we're doing with our colleagues at University College London and Uppsala with our very dear friends Håvard Hegre and Niels Metternich, both of whom are part of the agenda of this wonderful conference. And there we're trying to look at iViews, which is Uppsala's conflict prediction model, and combine it with Niels Metternich's. By the way, Uppsala's model is complex and multidimensional, but largely is georeferential, right? It's a georeferential conflict event model. And Niels's model, however, is very different in the sense that it has to do with an actor-centric approach. In other words, in a civil war context, for instance, like Yemen, it breaks the conflict down into a rebel and government dyad, which is helpful, and then looks at the behavior of all the rebel militias actors over time and makes monthly forecasts, right? Now, you know, again, there are all kinds of, this is not easy to combine, particularly if you decide to become more ambitious, such as we are, and try to combine it with the UN's very prized and protected security incident data. But we're trying to come up with some kind of model here that potentially has benefit. But again, in order to do all this work, we have to do some really important human-centered design work, ethnographic work, in order to better understand what kinds of issues are being really addressed and what kinds of decisions are being made. I'll stop there with one last sentence, which is that what I hope to discuss in the conversation that ensues is what are some of the problems here. You know, I've for instance analyzed some meta studies on conflict prevention and genocide prevention models. What are the problems around true positive rates? What are the problems around true negative rates? In other words, when do we correctly anticipate a lull or a decrease in violence? When do we correctly anticipate an uptick in violence? What are some of the issues around coding, right? What are some of the inconsistencies that we encounter in how different events get coded? The lack of definitional consensus, the fact that coders have to make qualitative assessments in putting these events, let's say in a georeferential conflict event model, into different categories. I hope to have that kind of discussion with you. And I also hope to have a discussion around what are some of the decisions that we hope to support through this vital area of work. Thank you so much, everyone, and back to you, Chris. Thank you,
Daanish. Yeah, a fascinating tour de force of the work you're doing there in the innovation cell, and rounding it off to some of those key challenges as well. Ayaka, would you like to speak briefly to some of the work that you've been leading? Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Chris, and then thank you everyone for joining this call. I'm such an honor to be here. I think I can speak to one of the recent projects that we have been doing in Bangsamoro, Mindanao. To give you some context, it's a post-conflict region after 40 years of the conflict, and then they are now preparing to establish autonomous government in 2022. So it's quite important for the region to understand what people's needs are, and then what is missing in order to stabilize the region even after that transition. So our task is to do the needs identification using big data. And then for this project, our approach is based on the collection of the data from social media and also traditional type of media, which is online news media. And then one of the limitations that we had was that because of the COVID, it was not possible for us to actually go and visit and then do the workshop, do the ground workshop, or like researching the other types of media used in the region. But we were lucky enough to collaborate with some of the local consultants who based in and work in Bangsamoro region. So leveraging these resources on the ground, we target the specific media and also social media data to identify what topics are well argued in the region, in what sentiment and what subjectivity, and how often these topics are associated with some of the expression in the needs or require or things like that. And we were succeeded in identifying some of the topics which we consider most well argued, but also most needed in the region. And then now we are implementing supplementary survey, so-called supplementary survey, in order to identify the need based on the region or other attributes such as gender or ethnicity or things like that. As you can see here, one of the, I think, challenges, which I hope to get some insights from through this discussion, is that when we choose to this kind of approach using the big data, sometimes it's difficult to identify the attributes information in the way that we want to, so like very specific attributes. So that is why we are combining both approaches, which is cutting edge using AI or big data, but also some of the traditional type of surveys or ground, I think, research, so that we can combine both result on that. One of the things that I want to highlight here is that because it's the topic of this seminar is about early warning, and then what we did in Mindanao is not necessarily about establishing early warning system or things similar to that, but I think understanding the people's needs in local level and what people are talking about on the ground is quite important to establish those systems in future. Because what we are doing is all about quantifying what the frustration is coming from. And then this frustration can be part of big drivers for the upcoming conflict or clashes. So I think this is quite interesting area to explore, even in terms of the early warning system conflict. Yeah, I stop here. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Ayaka. Spyros, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you for this opportunity to join this exchange on a super important topic. I'll provide a bit of a perspective from the World Bank as a development organization, which has been progressively more and more engaged in the violence, fragility, conflict space. This is a topic for us which is of extreme importance, particularly given, I think, the greater shift towards prevention that we've adopted over the past couple of years. Since the Pathways to Peace reports, which a number of you are probably aware of. The bank currently is focusing its efforts in engagement in fragility, conflict, and violence, within the framework of a new strategy, which spans the next 5 years or so, where we're really placing a very strong emphasis on trying to support efforts to, prevent and to mitigate drivers of violence and conflict from creating further destabilization and undermining development prospects. What's important about the new focus and directions the bank is taking in this space is that we're adopting this focus on prevention, not just in the traditional, what we call pre-conflict scenarios, right? Scenarios of emerging risk, but also in context of active crisis, where the bank is becoming more involved, where the focus here is on identifying those risk factors which could escalate violence or further, prolong the duration of a conflict, but also in post-crisis context of transitions out of conflict and fragility, where we need to be very mindful and be able to work in preventive fashion, identifying those factors and risks that could create a resurgence of conflict or lead to new forms of violence. So this is something which is a focus which cuts across the bank's kind of engagement across different types of situations in the violence conflict space. Within that, we have in the past couple of years developed a series of instruments which are quite powerful and really give us the means to do a lot more and to go a lot deeper in how we address conflict risks from a preventive perspective across these different types of institutions and across the bank's work. One, of course, is the new provision within IDA. IDA is, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the bank's lending arm to the poorest countries in the world. IDA now has what we call an FCV envelope within it, which provides a mechanism to provide additional financing to countries that are either trying to address from a preventive perspective certain factors before they lead to destabilization and violence. So in traditional prevention contexts, it also provides additional financing to countries in active crisis to support, to help prevent further escalation of dynamics, but also to support the resilience of institutions, populations to the shocks and risks and stresses created through conflict. And it also has provision for financing for countries which are emerging from conflict, what we call a turnaround allocation, to help them address the core structural drivers and risks and prevent that way what I said before in terms of resurgence of conflict. And also, so we have an important mechanism to provide more financing, more programming, more operations in these countries that hopefully can move the needle in addressing from a preventive perspective some of these risks. Now, really important to help us focus that financing and focus that programming are some of the analytical tools that we have developed and are developing that very much speak to the topic of today. One of them, which is an institutionalized tool, is what we call our risk and resilience assessment. It's an assessment that's undertaken at different points in the bank's programming cycle in the country, which allows us to have a better understanding of what are some of the drivers of conflict and the risks associated with that. But as a corollary to that, what are some of the priorities that the bank should be considering as it looks at its portfolio and its financing going forward? This instrument, which is it's an assessment, it's a one-off, and we're using that, and that's is very powerful for us in helping us be responsive and be able to program resources in the correct way in these kinds of contexts. In addition to that, we're also currently exploring different instruments around the tracking of violence and conflict, around the monitoring of risks associated with conflict and violence, but also in engaging with actors as UN, yourself at Peloria, and also trying to see how we can adapt some of the cutting edge analytics and models to allow us at a project level to better understand the risks associated with social unrest, violence, and potentially conflict down the road. We're in a development phase, I think, in terms of these instruments. The idea here is to provide on a real-time basis analytics that allow us to really kind of inform our thinking, our strategy operations in real time as we design projects, but also as we implement projects to ensure that we're being responsive to what are very often very fast-moving and volatile environments where the goalposts are always changing in terms of needs and beneficiaries. So we're in a development phase. So we're very happy to be part of this conversation, to learn from this, but also to contribute to it. In terms of, I think, some of the key challenges and opportunities going forwards, and I want to pick up on a couple of these. I think we do live, and I would agree with Eduardo, we live in very interesting times. There's an explosion of thinking and models and instruments that are coming out, as well as data sources, so we're in a very important time, to work together and identify, and address some of these challenges. We are, I think, very mindful of the constraints of the traditional predictive models for conflict. There's a range of issues, particularly when it comes to their use by a development institution like the bank. One of them, of course, which Eduardo I think touched upon, which is really important, is how we define the outcome variable, right? Conflict today, violence today, is not what it was 10 years ago, right? It's shifting, right? And we need to make sure that our models take into account these new forms of destabilizing violence and conflict and the drivers therein, right? I was in a panel yesterday, we were talking about risk factors which traditionally we consider exogenous: climate, population movements, macro financial crises. We need to be able to factor these in and really capture better the types of phenomenon that we are trying to predict or to try to define the risks of, right? The other, big challenge is, and was touched upon, the data scarcity in a lot of conflict-affected countries, right? This is a big issue, right? A lot of the new models are, for instance, predicated on the use of social media. In some contexts where we're working, there isn't even electricity, right? So how do we get data, right, to be able to use in these kinds of approaches? Which for us, leads to the question of how do we combine the more quantitative big data approaches with, tried and tested local participatory methods, right? And we've got some examples of that underway in some of our countries. So looking at more mixed methods approaches, particularly in countries which have these kinds of challenges when it comes to the quantitative data side. The third, challenge, almost paradoxically, is we're almost in a situation of methodological overabundance when it comes to the work in this space, right? And a lot of this is driven by different organizational interests, priorities, but also end uses, right? And while we're in a situation with, a million flowers blooming, part of, my worry personally is that this can kind of lend to fragmentation, right? So how do we better align what we do with a view to coming out of this with a common language, an analytical framework that we can apply across the board, right? And again, in a conflict space, the coordination, coherence of our efforts is absolutely paramount. So, but it starts with our analytics and how we do this and how we work together on those. So I wanted to throw those out, and I'll stop there just to give time for discussion. But thank you once again for this invitation.
Thanks so much, Spyros. Some fantastic sort of critical feedback also of that also of course relates to the speed with which this capacity is emerging, and really the highlights on some of a couple of those risks relating to, like you said, methodological overabundance. And I know that this issue of multidimensional risk, having myself participated in that sort of in that Pathways for Peace report, where I believe, if I recall correctly, there's a whole chapter sort of that really attempted to explore this, and there was to some extent a binary consideration of those issues. Right, here are the slow-moving factors of risk around social group specific grievances. And these are what we call exogenous shocks, whereas as climate-related natural disasters, as just one example, occur more rapidly, become more severe, and therefore are more persistent phenomena and more consistent phenomena. Are they still actually exogenous, as but one example? And then, does this require new methods? And how applicable are methods from one context to another? I think that's one sort of issue that maybe I'd ask our panelists to respond to. The context specificity. I believe you and both Eduardo referred to that issue in terms of data scarcity, particularly in FCV contexts, and it also relates to the great point that Daanish made, including in his response to one of the questions already in the chat. Thanks, Daanish. That there's context specificity in terms of the availability of data and, for example, the utility of different data sets given potentially disparate levels of geographic resolution. I know Eduardo and Ayaka are finding these issues, particularly in terms of temporal resolution as well. But I mean, all these obstacles can be present in different forms from one situation to another, which means, which effectively diminishes scope for scalability of one approach to others. So maybe I'll just quickly ask that question to our colleagues, and then we can also ask some of the more specific questions that are coming through in the chat. So if each of you have any response to to that issue of context specificity and data representativeness in some of those contexts that you just referred to, maybe just coming across the screen in the opposite direction. Eduardo, you first.
Sure. Thanks a lot. I wanted to say that this panel's quite interesting for me because I'm learning from Daanish about the work with tone and radio and TV, because I think that's clear to everybody that that is where the future lies in terms of data mining, if you will, because a lot of these conversations are occurring over the airwaves, and a lot of it is occurring between the lines, and I mean tone. So earlier I mentioned how difficult it is to sometimes translate sentiment from one culture framework to another, utilizing often a programmer that's coming from a completely different cultural framework himself. So I'm very interested in understanding the future of the technologies around tone, because it could be that we might be able to circumvent some of these translation issues. But that gets into some psychological territory where, do we have universal tones? Is the tone in one cultural framework the same as the tone in another? And some literature suggests yes, we share many characteristics across different ethnic groups. Other set of literature suggests no. So I think that's going to be the way that we approach this issue of, for example, not having social media data from some regions, because often you have just social media from the capital, and that's just one maybe social class. So I think radio is the future, TV is the future, and I'm excited to learn more about what's going on there.
Thanks, Eduardo. Daanish, and maybe you could just reiterate the response you gave to the great question also in the chat.
Sure, absolutely. So this is I'll do my best to answer the queries that were raised, because there's many different queries at the same time. So just in order of basically starting with the most recent thing, to Eduardo's point, I think that we have to be, just kind of literally getting into the granularity of doing this and the weeds of doing this. It's really noisy, So of course the claim here by companies like Empath AI or Affinity AI. Affinity AI, by the way, is doing, I think, has $1 billion valuation. They have like T-Mobile and Verizon as their customers. They claim that they've increased customer retention by 20%. And here, just so for context, the idea is that they listen to, when they say this call may be monitored or recorded, when you call your cell phone company, it is monitored and recorded, of course, and it's analyzed. And there, the idea is that they look at the tone that the customer is speaking to the customer service representative in, and then trying to create some kind of emotional profile of that person and make sure that they talk to the same customer service representative or to a customer service representative that has a similar personality or is good at handling that kind of personality. Right, and there are all kinds of claims here, and of course, those companies, the companies have decent valuations. I don't know. In doing the work practically myself, in the context of looking at interviews of Ansarullah or the Houthis or others, there's a lot of noise. How do I segment it? Do I segment it at the sentence level? Do I segment it at the word level, at the paragraph level? I don't know. Do I segment by looking at what the tone of the voice is when they're saying United Nations or Special Envoy or Martin Griffiths, the current Special Envoy in Yemen? So in abstract, these are great ideas, but in practicality, they're really challenging to implement. I'm just saying that. And again, I apologize for the scattered nature of my responses, but I'm trying to answer everything that was asked. On the GRACE mission, David Michaels asked an excellent question on the temporal and spatial resolution of the data. As you know, NASA's GRACE mission, which using triangulation looks at changes in the Earth's gravitational field. In other words, changes that are measurable based on the level of subsurface water, i.e. the level of groundwater. The Earth's gravitational field actually changes, and you can use that using two satellites that bob a little bit, right? That's the basic science behind the GRACE mission. But it's at a very high resolution. So we had to spend a lot of time and tears and sweat over trying to normalize the data here, which was not easy to do. I can go into the weeds of it. I can show you some of the slides around that if you're interested, David, and I'll put my email in so we can continue the conversation. How well is it working? To answer David's second question, which is I appreciate that question as well. And here, just again, so everyone is following what we're talking about, and it's not too technical. David's asking about how well is the correlation of georeferential conflict event data in Iraq, i.e., historical data, combined with the water diminishment data. How well is it working for you? I think we're just at the beginning. We just started talking to Steve Gorelick, who's a potential collaborator of ours at Stanford, who's a modeling expert when it comes to water. And we're trying to work on that model a little bit more to see how we can get it to become more accurate and more useful. I think we've only had 12, 15 months to build this. That's another good point, I suppose, that it takes a long time to build these things, right? It's not so straightforward. It sounds nice, it sounds cool, it sounds interesting, it sounds cutting edge, but there are many, many problems, like I just said, with this whole thing, with the tone, with this resolution. And then most of all, I give you a crystal ball, and I work very directly with undersecretaries general and special envoys and special representatives of the secretary general in different conflict contexts, i.e. the head UN person in a particular context. I can tell them, here's a pretty damn accurate monthly forecast of what's going to happen. What are they going to do with it? What kind of decisions are they going to make, right? And that's really where the rubber hits the road, and we need to have that conversation. I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Daanish. Fascinating, a fascinating contribution. Ayaka, briefly, by the way, we have just 5 minutes left. So Ayaka, if you're able to also just mention the response you gave to the good question in the chat, and Daanish and Spyros, if you're able to pass in the chat, if there's a link to where people can find out more about your important work. If you're able to put that in the chat, we can also allow you to mention it in conclusion. Sorry for holding you up, Ayaka. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris. I just briefly speaks to the context specificity, how to ensure that. I think one of the approaches that we always make sure to take is that start from the robust qualitative research. Of course, when it comes to data collection or everything, it's always started from there. So I think it's better to set the enough time for that types of activity as well. And in terms of the specific project in Bangsamoro, we make sure this context of specificity by incorporating local resources a lot. So when we have topics that we consider as a needs, using big data or any type of analysis, what we did is that so-called mini-making approach. And then not only get machines to have that result, we have a set of activities or workshops with local people so that we can interpret this, not just producing result, but we interpret using the human insights and then local insights. So I think that's what some of the examples that we can be context specific in that case. Regarding the question that I received in a chat box, it was about what was the actual result and then specific topics that that we found. I think one of the interesting point here is that if we take traditional approach for needs identification in this kind of cases, it's always asked to decide what kind of areas people are needing the most, like economics, food, or something like that. In a way, we have assumption like that. That's one approach. But what we found very interesting and useful for our big data driven approach is that we don't need to put that assumption first and then let machine get the result. And then some of the things that we didn't imagine we will have, but we did, was that like anti-drug policing activities, or some of the conflict standards between modern justice system and then traditional system. Those kind of voices regarding this topics was quite interesting. And then we are still doing this project, so really excited to see more. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Ayaka, and over to you, Spyros, for the final word.
Thank you, Chris. I think the context specificity, I think, is everything, right? Particularly given the nature of conflict and its causes. It's very difficult to generalize about this and develop predictive models. And they're useful to a certain extent, but when it comes down to, for instance, their use by a development agency, we need something which speaks to the realities and the needs of a specific country. So a lot of our focus is on developing kind of country-specific approaches and models. And there, the point that Eduardo made at the beginning, making sure that those that the concepts and the discourse we use that frames the model and defines the key outcomes has to be derived directly from context. And that's like, I think goes without saying. The second, I think, issue is, I think this was a point we raised in another panel yesterday, is it's very important to understand the variables that are related to the causes of conflict, right? But it's also important to understand vulnerability to associated risks, right? Which is a variable we don't normally look at, right? You know, and vulnerability and exposure to the risks of those factors which are associated with conflict might vary considerably, not just from country to country, right? But also within countries, right? If you take Yemen today, for instance, and you look at the exposure or the vulnerability to different types of conflict-related risks, it's not uniform across the country, right? And that has implication then for our measures. What we do then to reduce vulnerability or to provide tools or capacities to allow you know, populations, institutions to deal with those risks. So for us, part of contextualizing these approaches is also looking from the perspective of vulnerability. That also gives us our entry point, not only to understand what is the significance of the relationships between the different variables that we're seeing, right? Beyond the theory or hypothesis going into a particular country, but it also provides us the entry point for then figuring out what we do about it, right? How do we actually you know, do something from a preventive or mitigated perspective that allows, you know, these risks or the probability of these dynamics playing out from a conflict perspective to be reduced, right? So again, I think for us, these are critical elements. And like I said, I think also respond to the questions in chat. You know, I'm not in a position to speak to specific instruments or results at this point, largely because a lot of this is kind of really in development, in piloting. We're in a phase of development and exploration, which, you know, but we're definitely, you know, engaging on these issues and very keen to continue the conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you, Spiros. Thank you, Ayaka, Daanish, Eduardo. I think colleagues have put their contact details and the location of their work or links to it in the chat there. For those that are interested, please follow up. This is a really important conversation. And maybe just to leave with one final thought, which is if we have some of the world's leading experts here who are demonstrating this level of humility about the persistent uncertainty, not just with across context, but within individual contexts that they're pouring time and energy into already, then you know, I think there's also scope you know, for these actors and organizations to play a leadership role on a significant emerging private sector area, which is environmental, social, and governance oriented investing, because there's a lot of assertive language coming out of coming from our colleagues in financial services industry in particular about we're investing into ESG. But if we on this call are not able to identify the negative environmental, social, and governance externalities that are occurring, let alone are associated with certain forms of commerce or entities, then I'm not so sure those that have spent their careers focused on financial services products necessarily either. And so perhaps this may be a next conversation as to, you know, how we can begin to bring that coherence that Spiros mentioned to the sort of overabundance and fragmentation of this area, so that some kind of at least elementary baseline can begin to be developed, so that that area ESG can be tied to and even leveraged by our colleagues in the peace and development space. Maybe another whole conversation for another time, but with that with that final comment, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, for the fantastic comments, and most of all, of course, to our great panelists for their important contributions. Thank you, everybody.